My first point must be, as a general point to make, that the election results are not as dramatically different from the past as you may have been led to believe. Or rather, in some respects, they are dramatically different, in two particular respects to which I'll come. But in the main respect, they're not quite so different. For example, but they are different from what we were all expecting. The result was therefore a surprise, as Gerald just said. So I want to begin with a question which was put to me actually by Gellert in an interview yesterday. Was this a surprise? And the answer is, yes, it was surprising, but that was because it ran contrary to all of the polls beforehand. If we hadn't had any polls to look at, we would probably have assumed a result very similar to the one we got. Why do I say that? That is in terms of who formed the government. The Tories, we would not have been surprised that the Tories had won. After all, we would have said they enjoyed some traditional advantages of a government running for office again. They had an economic recovery, a broadly favourable press, which was very partisan, and a weak opposition leader. And those kind of things generally mean a Tory victory. In 1983, for example, they led to Mrs. Thatcher getting a majority of 144 when Michael Foot led the Labour Party and the economy was beginning to recover under Thatcherism. Then, in addition to having these broad advantages, the Tories also ran a very effective professional campaign. And then they were the government. And unless the country is in grave crisis, that is normally a slight advantage. If you are Prime Minister, you look much more like a Prime Minister than someone who's never been a Prime Minister. You can put it that way, and it does persuade some voters. So without the polls, this is a result we would probably have expected. It was the polls that made it a surprise. Now, the exception to this, which I'll come to, is that the Scottish Nationalists and the UKIP did well, so very well. Now that, again, was expected, but the degree of the SNP's success and the degree of UKIP's rise are remarkable. The first is that has been generally recognised. The second, about UKIP, has not been, and we should come on to that. Now, why did the polls get it wrong, as Jerry said? Well, one answer is, and it's an answer that's beginning to persuade me, is that they didn't. Two polls, the exit poll, of course, and the Survation poll, a late one, got it right. But as I say, they polled late. One after the vote, and Survation on the afternoon of the election itself, where they detected a swing towards the Conservatives. And I think that when you look at the polls, all clustering around 34%, both major parties, and you look at the actual result, yes, the overwhelming likelihood is that there was a late swing to the Tories. Now, why might that have been the case? Well, one very ingenious explanation, put in a letter to the Survation pollster, was that the polls were part of the reason for the last-minute swing. People saw that there was an almost neck-and-neck race, and that their vote might therefore actually count. It really mattered. So they could affect the result, and they knew that because of the polls. Secondly, the prosperity theme, which was the theme that the Conservative campaign particularly stressed, under the influence of the generally well-regarded Australian political campaigner, Lynton Crosby, who, by the way, has had no failures in British politics. He's won a couple of elections in London, not favourable Conservative territory for Boris Johnson. Well, the prosperity theme finally really worked. For a long time, people were mystified during the campaign that the economy has been doing well for the last 18 months. Most of the figures are very favourable. Why haven't the Conservatives benefited more? Well, they did. And they did because I think a lot of people, marginal voters, were thinking throughout the campaign, well, it looks as though the Tories have got it right on the economy. They look better than Labour. On the other hand, we've been let down before. we've been told, and that the Hungarians will recognize this, of course, we've been told again and again that recovery, prosperity was coming, and then somehow the train never arrives at the station. What can happen on occasions like this is one set of bad economic statistics can derail a campaign. Now, I remember that happening myself when I was a candidate long ago in 1970. It looked as though Harold Wilson was going to win the 70 election easily. The reason he didn't was because he was running on the campaign of economic success, and with 3 days before polling day, the trade figures came out and showed an alarming drop. Now, as a matter of fact, those figures were irrelevant, really. There was one item in foreign trade of an enormous size which distorted the figures. But I can tell you, overnight, the atmosphere of the election campaign changed. And that might have happened here if some bad statistics had emerged, but none did. And so the people, when they're told it's neck and neck, and it now looks as though the Tories have actually improved the economy considerably, and there's not a trick of some kind, they tended to move in the Tory camp. And that was helped by the fact that the Labour campaign, or Labour itself, is widely distrusted on the economy, widely seen as partly responsible for the generally bad world economy and British economy since 2008, and therefore not really trusted by the voters. The fact that the Conservatives could claim this convincingly underlined Labour's underlying weakness. The fourth was something that emerged in the campaign and changed minds, and that is the rise of the SNP, and in particular the strong performance of its leader, Nicola Sturgeon, in the leadership debates. All of these things brought Scotland much more to the attention of English voters. And it didn't bring Scotland to their attention in a favourable way. It seemed that the Scots were hostile to the English, anxious to not only break away, but also to kind of threaten them with ruling the country, installing an unpopular Labour government, and achieving a much more left-wing economic agenda than the considerable majority of the English would want. So, in a way, one of the reasons for voting Conservative here was to stop the Scottish tail wagging the English dog, in policy in general, but in particular on economic policy and spending. And finally, and this is an interesting weakness, the Conservatives were vulnerable on one economic question, which was the very sharp continuing rise in debt. Much of the spending of the government has been financed by debt for a long time. Now, it's rising. The Conservatives said they would bring it under control. They have brought the structural deficit, or claim to be bringing the structural deficit under control. But the actual amount of debt that the country has accumulated has gone up much faster under the Tories than it did under Labour. Now, we can argue the whys and wherefores, but this was a vulnerability, but it was one that no one on the left could attack because they were proposing bigger spending rather than less. The only person who did so, and did it effectively, was Nigel Farage of UKIP. But Farage's position was weakened as the campaign went on, and it seemed that the only real defence against a Scottish National Party Labour government was voting for the largest party that might resist that, which would be the Conservatives. So all of these factors came together towards the end of the campaign, and I think that the lady who predicted that the evidence of the polls that everything was close, neck and neck, that was a factor in switching people to the Conservative Party at the last minute. So it was a surprise. But because it was a surprise, the Tory victory over Labour has been overhyped. It was a victory. There's no doubt about that. Not only did the Conservatives gain from the fact that Labour lost seats in Scotland on wholesale, but they, by the way, if the Scottish seats hadn't changed hands, the number of Labour seats would have increased slightly by about 15. But the second thing is, the Conservatives made their own luck. They ran a good campaign, And their number of seats, they won 24 seats for a surprise majority of 12. But look at your charts for a minute. The chart on the chart 1, which begins with the share of the votes, which has the share of the votes. If you look at the national vote and the Tory share of it, you will see that the Tory share is 36.9. Now, that's not a high share for a winning political party. It's more common than it used to be since Blair. But the fact is that Mrs. Thatcher, for example, regularly won 43% of the vote. John Major won, I think, just 44%. In a 2.5 party system, that's a substantial majority. 36.9 is not a substantial majority. It's a respectable win, but no more than that. So it isn't quite the Tory triumph that you may have got the impression from the headlines. That increase that the Tories gained is less than 1%, 0.8%. Now, it's better than the opposite, but they didn't have much room for manoeuvre here. So this is therefore a respectable victory, but not much more than that. Now, does that victory does that margin understate their position? Yes, it does in one respect. Everyone has been aware that the Conservatives have been operating under constituency boundaries that advantaged the Labour Party and that were a disadvantage to them. And we don't want to exaggerate this, but at one point, the Conservatives would have won the same number of seats as Labour, even though they enjoyed a 6% lead over them in the actual share of the vote. So that will now change. The reason it will change is that the constituency boundaries are going to be redrawn in January. That should have happened about 4 years ago, but because of internal politics in the coalition, with the Liberal Democrats being angry that the Conservatives had not supported their plans for electoral reform, and those plans had been defeated in a referendum, the Liberal Democrats prevented the constituency boundary reforms, so that a system that the Liberals themselves felt was unfair became even more unfair. In other words, it was unfair even on the terms of the system. Even if you approve of the first past the post system, the constituency boundaries meant it was unfair. So that's redrawing the boundaries will make a change. And indeed, Anthony Wells, whom some of you may know, he runs the UK polling report. I'd say it's the single most authoritative and reasonable and well-informed report on polling, said as follows. Some people have asked me how this election would have looked if the revised boundaries proposed in the last Parliament had gone through. I have done a rough rejig of my provisional boundary calculations using the result of this election. And if the new boundaries had gone through, the Conservatives would have won. Remember, the number of parliamentary seats would go down from 630 to 600. The Conservatives would have won 322 seats, 9 fewer than they did, but enough to give them a healthy majority of 44 in a Commons of 600 MPs. Labour would have won 204 MPs, 28 fewer. The SNP would have won 50 seats, slightly more, and would have pushed Labour out of Scotland entirely, and the Lib Dems would have won just 4, so which they got 8. Now, in other words, the next election takes place on somewhat more favourable ground for the Conservatives in 5 years' time, in terms of constituency boundaries. And that in a close election, that could be important. Now, let's look at the Labour Party for a second. You might get the impression from the resignation of Miliband as leader, and from all the newspaper reports over the weekend, that Labour's decline has not only been dramatic in this election, but is the beginning of a slippery slope which will lead to the party's never holding power again. I should say that after every election, people say this about the main opposition party. I mean, they said this about the Conservatives last time. Who knows when this party will ever regain power again? It's losing votes to immigrants. It's losing the North. Anthony has actually written a very powerful polemic on those lines, which I think is generally better founded than most. But the fact is, politics is a game in which if one party suddenly becomes weak or suddenly looks damaged, it's a lot. Other voters sometimes move towards it. If there's, let's say, you have a wave of immigration which produces a different election result, then many of the voters who were native voters in the country switch their allegiance to a party to resist this. Anyway, if you look at the number of ambitious young people who this weekend have announced that they're going to run for leader of the Labour Party, you realise these people plainly think Labour has a future. They don't think they're joining a party that is headed for the scrap heap. They think that it will have a future, but they think it will be a different future to the one represented by the previous leader. It will probably be a future somewhat like that recommended by Tony Blair. The Labour left ran the party, it ran the campaign, it laid out the ideas, and as a result, the Labour left has burnt its fingers, and the Labour right and mainstream will come back into influence. Now, so far I've been saying things are not as dramatic as you may have read, and that's true. But in two respects, they are dramatic. The first is the rise of the SNP. That is a truly substantial political event. It genuinely deserves the title of earthquake. And it's going to be something that, I don't say monopolises, but that certainly will obsess the next Parliament and political discussion generally. Independence is now a possibility. I don't say it's a likelihood, but it's a strong possibility. And it's powerful because in the case of Scotland, nationalism is allied with left-wing redistributionist socialist policies. The SNP, which wasn't always a left party, has plainly become one under Alex Salmond and now Nicola Sturgeon. And this made it possible for Labour to win whole swathes of what used to be loyal Labour voting territory, particularly in the west of Scotland. And now I come to the UKIP rise. Now, in my view, this is the single most important story in the election. It's far more dramatic than anything else. It is even more dramatic in the long run than the rise of the SNP. And it's being overlooked by commentators from both sides who really, for their own reasons, want UKIP to disappear. It's not going to disappear. Look first at who was in second place. The Daily Telegraph has done an analysis of second place performances. Then they have an interesting, go on the Telegraph website, we can't reproduce it here unfortunately, it's a very clever electronic interactive kind of map. It shows, among other things, the SNP's brutal defeat of the Labour Party with the whole of the north of the British Island turned yellow. Although, by the way, a very large proportion of Scots still vote Labour. But the real story is UKIP's increasing power. UKIP came second in 125 places. The Liberal Democrats, who had 56 seats in the last Parliament, they came second too, but in only 66 constituencies. So when the next elections begin, or when any by-elections take place, UKIP is already in an extremely strong position. Now, secondly, look at the chart, the first chart there. UKIP has gone up from 3.1% of the national vote last time to 12.6% today. When you factor Scotland out of that and just look at England, it's actually gone up to 14% of the vote. Now, everyone talks about the difficulty for small parties in the British system of first past the post, and they're quite right. And that's why UKIP only got one seat in this election. But it is actually the single largest party representing Britain in the European Parliament. It has won a lot of constituencies in local government. It controls councils or is represented on many councils. It now is an actual party. That is to say, it has constituency organisations, it has members, it has a party structure. It produced what was generally regarded, and this is rather comic, as the best election manifesto in this campaign. It went to the trouble of going to a respected city firm of, I think, auditors and getting them to cost their proposals. The result was that people stopped really, in a major way, attacking them as a party which didn't have any ideas. I remember the most damaging question that asked at the party at the election launch was, manifesto launch was, why have you only got one minority person photographed in the manifesto document? And this resulted in outrage from UKIP people, including a large number of West Indian and Indian researchers for the party who stood up at the back and shouted. So effectively, the party is there to stay. It's not going away. And of course, if the government had, in the next 5 years, an easy run, if it wasn't dealing with major problems, if it wasn't going to find its supporters were upset and discontented with it from time to time, if it didn't have to face occasional by-elections because of deaths and other causes, appointments, then this wouldn't matter. But the fact is, politics doesn't stop after an election. In fact, it starts immediately the day after the election. And that effectively means that between now and 5 years' time, there is going to be, UKIP is going to be a major and ever-present threat, particularly, well, a threat to whom? And this is where I think you've got to take something important on board. The general commentary has not played up the success of UKIP here in quadrupling its share of the vote. And in one respect, they've been positively misleading, which is interesting. And that is, they say it's now a bigger threat to Labour than to the Conservatives. And it certainly is taking votes away from Labour in the north of England, where Labour has a lot of seats. But there is a slight misunderstanding here. The commentators tend to imagine that the votes are taken from Labour because they're working class, they're blue-collar workers. But this assumption simply awards the working class to Labour as its own electoral property, so that anyone who doesn't vote Labour is somehow damaging Labour, defecting from Labour. That has never been the case in British politics. The Labour Party in British politics has never got more, at any point really since its foundation, than 2/3 of the working class vote. 1/3, and more sometimes, regularly went to the Conservative Party, all through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. That 1/3 of the working class provided the Tories with 1/2 of their vote because of the size of the working class electorate. Now, when you hear that they're more of a threat to Labour because they didn't vote Labour, the other aspect of that is these are these are working class people with, broadly speaking, conservative social values, or perhaps strong patriotic or nationalist instincts, who would often normally in the past, have voted Conservative. But in recent years, they have ceased to do so, because both Labour and Conservative parties have ceased to appeal to them, either emotionally or in terms of their interests. The Labour Party has become, and this has happened throughout the advanced world, a party which grew out of the working class, but which now appeals mainly to progressive, middle-class, professional people, and certainly aims its appeal to them. And that's what Blair did, and that's what probably the party will do in the future. It's a threat to the Conservatives for a different reason. The Conservative Party, since democracy, has had more or less a monopoly on patriotism in the electoral system. Now, I don't mean by that other parties are anti-patriotic. I mean that the kind of patriotic appeal which the Conservatives made in elections and at other times, except for a period in the 1940s, was really never made by the Labour Party. They weren't anti-patriotic, but they didn't appeal to the Union Jack, the record of the country, the British Empire, any of these things, which does appeal to people on these grounds. So the Labour Party is threatened because UKIP is a competitor for the working class vote, and the Tory Party is threatened because UKIP is a threat to is appealing to working class conservatism. It's a threat to the Tory Party's monopoly of conservatism, and that's going to be a big factor. Now, And that's the second point I would make. Now, I want you to look at the other chart. You will see the number of seats each party has in Parliament. And you will see that two things, really. There's a small majority for the Conservatives, it's 12. They have, and secondly, they are, excuse me, well, I find it myself. Not so sure I have it, actually. But never mind, I think I know it. They have a majority of 12. Well, you know, 3 deaths, 3 appointments to of MPs to political positions elsewhere, that majority could go. It probably won't, but it could go. On the other hand, look at the huge number of smaller parties there are. There are 8 members of the Democratic Unionist Party. There are 2 members of the Ulster Unionist Party. Generally speaking, without being unkind, I think it's fair to say that these parties are up for sale. I mean, what they will say is, if you give us another bridge, if you increase the grant for education in Northern Ireland, if you help my constituency, you'll have my vote. And well, I think there are politicians, there are people involved in politics in this room. I think we'd all have to admit that those kind of deals are the part and parcel of the political game. No party, however pure, can avoid doing them if it wants to remain in power. And that means that the Conservative majority is slightly larger than it might otherwise appear. They can probably last a full parliament. But at the same time, there are issues in which they are going to have rows with the opposition, but rows also with their own parliamentary colleagues. And I'll come on to 3 issues now, which are the 3 issues that they're going to have to face in this parliament are as follows: economic competence, the European referendum, and how to deal with Scotland. Economic competence. The Conservatives won this election because their reputation for economic competence is higher than that of the Labour Party. That is one of the things I mentioned before, and it may be the single biggest factor. So it's very important to them that they don't have an economic crisis, or if they do, they handle it expeditiously and from the standpoint of the British people, fairly. I say that last point because fairness and unfairness are areas in which the Labour Party starts out with a natural advantage with the voters, and the Conservatives are regarded very often as the party of the rich and uncaring. Now, they've already said, everybody said really, that in order to deal with in order to keep the economy on an even keel, and also to reduce the amount of debt, which is a major factor, then they're going to have major cuts in public spending. And people have talked of $12 billion cuts in welfare spending. That's a lot. And so far, the cuts that people have had to endure, there haven't been cuts. I mean, people now regularly refer in British politics, and I suspect in Hungarian politics too, to something as a cut, when they mean that the increase they had planned to spend is going to be slightly more moderate than it was before. But there will be painful cuts, and there have been some painful cuts in the number of personnel. And that will therefore be something that will be both unpopular, but something they pledged to do, and something which, in a sense, the economists and the market will consider necessary. So Ian Duncan Smith, widely respected as a good man and somebody who cares about the poor, an advocate of social justice policies within the Conservative Party, he has now been placed in charge again of making changes in the welfare system, and that's going to be a major political battle. He will have the party on his side in that. There are very few Tories who don't support him, but he'll have a united opposition too. So that will be interesting. Now, the second is different. On the question of a European referendum, and that, Gerald was saying to me before that this would probably take place earlier than 2017, when it has to take place. I think it will take place earlier because the government will want to get it out of the way. They would like to establish clearly whether or not Britain is going to be in or out of the market. They think that will calm economic markets in general, and they don't want the implied disruption hanging over their heads. So it probably will be moved forward. But the problem for the government on that there is as follows: that a European referendum will lead, obviously, to the question of, are you supporting Britain's membership, or do you want to leave the European Union? And Cameron will say, I've been to Europe, I've negotiated a better deal for us, now it's completely in Britain's interest. My old friends on my right here, they may still think we should leave, but I can assure them that Britain is now in a Europe. The old phrase the Tories used was, we want to be in Europe, but not governed by Europe. And now we're no longer going to be governed by Europe. The opposition will say, these changes are worthless, but we support the government, because the other major parties all support the government on this. It will be UKIP, which is one MP now, and their own Eurosceptic supporters, who will be the people saying, we object to this. And then Cameron will have to work out, first of all, how large the rebellion is, potentially. Secondly, whether he should appease it or whether he should try to crush it. And in particular, whether or not he should allow his cabinet members who take a different view from him. And one of them, for example, is Michael Gove, who has just been appointed as the Justice Minister and is a powerful figure in the Conservative Party, whether or not they will be allowed to campaign for Britain to leave Europe, or whether they have to remain silent or actually campaign for. This all promises very dramatic parliamentary scenes. Sometimes the Labour opposition and other parties will try to wrong-foot the government, get them to lose votes. Ideally, from the standpoint of the left, if they could defeat the bill even before it gets to before a referendum is made formal and official, they would be happy with that. And the government might not be too displeased, as a matter of fact. But nonetheless, this promises to be a major controversy, one in which the government and its supporters will be at odds, and the government and the opposition will be on the same side. My own prediction, for what it's worth, is that the government will get a referendum. The referendum will be won by the government. Britain will remain in Europe. And then, 2 years later, the whole issue will start up again, because decisions will be taken by the government, which their opponents will say, but you told us this wasn't going to happen. And the government will say, well, of course we said that in good faith, but times are different. And those kind of explanations never please people. And there will therefore, I don't say there will be another referendum in the Parliament. There won't be, of course. But the crisis between Britain and Europe will get going again. And I don't think this crisis will ever end as long as Britain is a member of the European Union. I think it will just take different forms all the time until, ladies and gentlemen, you all get fed up with having Britain as an obstructive and fractious member, and everybody agrees that we'll leave. However, that's not a statement, that's not a prediction for this Parliament, it's probably for the one after this. Okay, Scotland, finally. Well, I'm going to be quick here and end, because probably your questions are going to be more interesting than my answers. But the point I would say is this. The government is faced with a very difficult situation, because on the one hand, it's pledged to give Scotland full fiscal autonomy and a transfer of resources from the rest of the United Kingdom. This is beginning to anger the English electorate, who not only resent a continued drain of subsidies to Scotland. They're not massive, by the way, but they're still there. But also resent being told by the people who pocket their subsidies what monstrously cold and unfeeling people they are, and how Scots are much warmer-hearted and more compassionate. So there's a kind of anti-Scottish feeling developing in England, a kind of English nationalism of a kind of feeble kind. And that will be the first problem that the government faces. But the second is the objective problem. Either Scotland is given independence, or probably, as in Canada with Quebec, the way that Scotland is prevented from seeking or getting independence is by increasing the bribes to it and giving way on every substantive issue. And that distorts the politics of the whole of the country, that has happened in Canada until very recently, actually. But every time the English Canadians were feeling angry and upset, the Quebec separatists would stage another referendum, and everyone would rally around and write the cheque again. So I think you're going to have that kind of debate in English politics for the next 3 or 4 years. I think its outcome is completely impossible to predict. It's not inevitable. It would cause immense disruption, ill feeling, a loss of international prestige for all of the nations in the UK. The country's nuclear base would have to be moved from the Clyde, and no one knows where else to put it. The British seat on the UN Security Council would be threatened. The debt would have to be reallocated between London and Edinburgh in what would be very tough negotiations, made unsentimental by the anti-English rhetoric of the nationalists. An independent Scotland's monetary policy would continue to be set either by London or by Frankfurt. Scotland's banks and financial services would migrate south, and much else. Even the possibility, however seemingly absurd, of a new old alliance between Scotland and Putin's Russia would have to figure in NATO's contingency planning, and you can imagine how Putin would enjoy saying the same kind of things about Scotland as the English have been saying about Ukraine. Finally, the Scot Nats would be continually engaged, like Parnell's Irish Party at the turn of the 19th century, in parliamentary disruption. What we know of Scotland's economic plans, the SNP's economic plans for an independent Scotland, they would have to be downsized from their original content by the fall in the price of oil. And there is, anyway, a massive contradiction between a flourishing, competitive Scotland and the SNP's vision of a welfare socialist state. But I wouldn't rule independence out for this reason. Independence itself may prove to be an economic factor. Scottish pride would not allow the defeat that returning to Britain would symbolise. Scottish ingenuity would, after a point, be prepared to take very tough decisions to make independence a success. Among the countries, which you would know well, that have flourished unexpectedly after detaching themselves from a richer neighbour are Slovakia and I'd say Singapore too. An independent Scotland would therefore need its own Lee Kuan Yew, following a different national strategy of low taxes, an investment-friendly climate, and work for rather than welfare. But I wouldn't bet against that happening. It would be reckless to rely on such a thing, and a Brussels offering European subsidies might undermine any local Lee Kuan Yew with a new excuse to avoid hard economic realities. But it would be almost as reckless to deny the possibility that the nation of Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson could not find an economic reformer lurking in its midst. That's the background. There are many other points which I'm sure you would like to raise. I'm very happy to hear them. And if other people want to give their opinions on this election as well, I'd be also happy to listen, because, as I say, one of the factors which we slightly stymied yesterday is the full exit poll results have not been published as yet. They will be. And they tell us the different social class breakdown, the age breakdown, and so on of the different parties in the election. We'll know more when we get that. We haven't got it yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. That was terrific. Why don't you stay there?
Okay.
And we'll take questions from the floor. Or you first.
Yes. Anthony, I have to ask you.
Do you want to have some other people
Okay,
first, or then
okay.
if you call me in a minute, yeah?
Okay.
I'll just have a few, I'm trying to keep
Please.
this down here.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Oh.
Yes. Yes, Peter. Well,
It's inevitable that I always venture to speak first. Well, first of all, very much enjoyed the talk, very informative, pointing out many things which we have not thought about. I think this large turnout also shows that Hungary has an old and continued strong interest in what is going on in Britain. I have one comment which I think is important to note. My friend Tibor Frank pointed out very rightly that in Hungary people tend to think that labor means munkáspárt, which is not the case. It's not a party of workers, but a party of labor. In Hungary there used to be a party of work, Tisza István, Nemzeti Munkapárt. But what is much more important is, you mentioned many things, but you haven't mentioned two issues which is usually covered in the world media. One is the role of women. Well, the Prime Minister is extremely polite to his wife. I was very much impressed. But we did not see a strong performance by women, except in Scotland. So what is your comment on that? And the more important for Hungary is immigration. You haven't mentioned immigration, although people say that all the parties campaign on immigration.
Yes, thank you. On the women question first, well, about a year before the election, Cameron had a reshuffle of the cabinet and junior ministries in preparation for the election. And he made a number of changes, but one of the changes he made was to bring forward younger women into the cabinet and into the government. And they have all done well in the election, with the exception of one, Esther McVey in Birkenhead, and Birkenhead is quite near where I was brought up, and it's not naturally favourable territory these days to the Conservatives. It used to be, actually, but it isn't now. And she lost her seat. She fought a good campaign, they thought she would hold it, but in the end she lost by about 300 votes. A very narrow loss. So the experiment, so to speak, of having more women in government and young, appealing, attractive, professional women, an experiment which Mrs. Thatcher never felt she needed to have, that is generally regarded as a success. And as a result, in the weekend papers, there's been a suggestion that more women are going to be brought into the government, and names are mentioned and so on. And there's certainly more women on the Conservative benches than there used to be. My own feeling here is that the Cameron's actions in the reshuffle, not all of which I agreed with, probably helped to blunt the attack on the Conservative Party as unfavourable to women. And secondly, that of course when really major questions are at stake, people tend to be less interested in the sex of the person they're voting for than in the policies that they're advocating. And in this occasion, I think that there were a number of women in the leadership debates. The leader of the Plaid Cymru was a woman, the leader of Scott Nats was a woman, the leader of the the Greens is a woman. They dominated in some respects the debate. But there was an interesting twist there as well. I looked at the polls. The newspaper coverage of the debates, particularly the one with, I think, 7 people in, all played up, not simply Nicola Sturgeon, who did have an impact, but all the role of the other women. But when you looked at the opinion polls as to who had dominated the debates, the polls showed quite clearly that the 3 people who dominated them were David Cameron, Ed Miliband and Nigel Farage. So there is a certain political correctness in this. People feel obliged to praise the role of women. There's no doubt that Nicola Sturgeon did have a very strong charismatic appeal, and she changed the debate in some respects. But the other women leaders were just weren't as well as informed and as sharp, and the attempts to talk up their role really didn't work. Immigration. So I do think women will continue to play this role in British politics. We're reaching the point where it would be perfectly natural to have women at the very top of politics on the one hand, and then when that happens, people will stop thinking about it as an important criterion. They'll just take it for granted. Now, immigration. Well, it's interesting. Immigration didn't play a great role in this election, partly because everybody said the same thing, even though I think any detached observer will think that they didn't at all mean the same thing. And the Conservatives, for example, completely missed their target. of reducing net immigration into Britain in the last 5 years. In fact, it increased sharply in the last year, and they were humiliated by this. The reason it's going to become an issue again is partly because people feel strongly about it. They want less immigration. There's a feeling that it changes the social character of the country dramatically in ways they don't always like. Now, the reason why it will, however, become a big issue again is that there is very little prospect, it seems to me, maybe you differ, that the European Union is going to change the rules allowing free migration between European Union countries, and of course Hungary doesn't want it to do that. And therefore, when it comes to the question of whether Britain should remain in the European Union, immigration will be a factor. The opponents will say, look, we can't control our borders while we're in the EU, and the government can't say, oh yes, we can. They'll have to find other substitute issues, and they say things like, well, we're going to make it harder for anyone from Europe to claim welfare benefits until they've lived for a certain amount of time in the country. That, I think, is not a persuasive reply, and that's a weakness. That's probably the single biggest weakness in the pro-government, pro-EU campaign. The second thing which is going to make it dramatic is, of course, you probably have read in the papers over the weekend and this morning, which is that the European Commission is proposing to deal with the problem of migrant deaths in the Mediterranean and the general problem of legal migration into Europe, with a policy of probably accepting more on the one hand, while distributing them, so to speak, fairly around the European Union. My own feeling there is that that's not an unreasonable position, but in a way, why Europe? If there is a crisis in the Middle East and in Africa, why should Europe alone be among the countries that receive these immigrants? For example, after '56, when we had to deal with the problem of Hungarian refugees after the revolution, they went all over the world. I mean, there was a big conference in Geneva at which the countries all agreed to take so many. Now, somehow the economic situation is different, the international situation is different, and also the Hungarians, there was a huge worldwide sympathy for the Hungarians, so people were more willing to open their doors to Hungarians, and also Hungarians have always been popular immigrants, so there's that factor as well. That's not so true of others. And finally, and this is the most important point about public disquiet, what worries people about immigration from North Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere is not mainly the Muslim question, that's partly there. It is the fact that they think that the potential pool of immigrants from those countries is limitless. There are millions of people who want to leave those countries, and with good reason, and come to a safe and prosperous part of the world. And that's not true. It wasn't true for Hungarians. I mean, we're talking about quite a small number of people. And nobody expected that Eastern Europe was suddenly empty and all come to live in Wimbledon. And there is that feeling about Africa and elsewhere. And then finally, of course, there is I must tell this story because it's Conor Cruise O'Brien, the distinguished Irish diplomat, was at that point in charge of negotiating Ireland's part in the Hungarian emigration. And Ireland took a number, and he rang up. He was in charge of the Foreign Office side of things, and he rang up the Home Office, which actually had to approve the visas. And the man rang him back and said, I'm sorry, Conor, we're not taking any of these people. They're from a communist country, and we don't admit people from communist countries. And Conor said, but my dear fellow, these Hungarians are anti-communists. And he said, look, I don't care what kind of communists they are. We're not coming in. So, I mean, we're living in a different world now, and I think it's much harder one for the British government to negotiate. So that's why I think that the European issue is going to be a real, roller coaster of thrills and spills. Thank you.
Do you want me to say a few words then, John?
Yes.
Shall I say a few words now? Yeah?
Please do.
Yeah, well, sorry. My name's Anthony Schofield. I know both of you gentlemen, particularly Jerry, very well. I just happen to be here in Budapest by chance. I didn't know you were having this meeting, but I'll inflict myself on you for literally 3 or 4 minutes, just raising a few points. John has given a wonderful overall picture. He's terribly experienced in the whole of the Anglosphere, America, Australia, UK. So what he says is pretty always right, in my opinion. But I'd just like to say 2 or 3 things. I was involved in founding UKIP 20 years ago, so I know quite a lot about it.
Anthony, I've got an idea. Why don't you speak from here?
Can I hear me? Okay.
There's a microphone.
Sorry,
No, that's
I won't say much anyway.
No, absolutely do.
I don't need to say
Speak
very much.
away.
No, about 20 years ago, I was involved in founding a political party, which is quite an interesting experience. It's UKIP, and it was founded, it was in my offices for several years. I then fell out with the leader and left the party. I haven't changed my views particularly, but I haven't been involved in the actual party for several years. The second thing is that recently, though, I have become involved in a group of EU skeptic organisations putting together a sort of proto-campaign for the EU referendum, which, as John has explained, is likely to be coming up. And I just want to throw 3 or 4 points into the pool. First of all, I don't think Scotland, winning a referendum does not make you independent. And winning a referendum on false premises, which is what is going on in Scotland, it does not make you independent. Can I just throw you one light on that? The Scottish nationalists lost their referendum because of a number of factors. One of them was to do with the financial and currency aspect. Did they change their policy? No. Now, I would have thought someone who seriously wants to win a referendum in the future, having been exposed as not having a realistic policy, would have changed it. But they haven't. And Alex Salmond, the former leader of and still very powerful man in the Scottish Nationalist, is widely suspected of not really wanting independence. And you cannot, the fact of the matter is that Scotland is not like Slovakia and the Czech Republic because it has a large amount of English capital deployed in the Scottish financial sector. That would migrate as soon as they felt that Scotland was likely to go independence. After all, why should you have your assets in one country and your liabilities in another country, in another jurisdiction? You'd be completely mad. So every life insurance company, pension fund, bank would all have to move to London, and the Scots would lose a hell of a lot of jobs. So I just do not think that is actually a runner that Scotland will become independent. I don't think Alex Salmond even thinks that it's a good idea. But I'm more interested now for Hungary in the European situation. And I want to just throw you, because we've done a lot of thinking. I know you might think, well, we should have done this years ago, but we have been doing a lot of thinking recently. And I want to throw about 4 very quick ideas into the pond. One is, I think a lot of people now in the Eurosceptic movement in Britain have now realised that the single market and the European Union are 2 different things. In other words, they've looked at Norway and Iceland and they've realised that you can be a member of the single market and without being a member of the EU. Forget all this stuff about fax democracy. That is a pack of lies told by a previous pro-EU Norwegian Prime Minister. If you look at the EEA constitution and how it works with the EU, it's a 2-pillar situation. There is no way in which the EU Parliament overrides the EEA countries. So business in the UK makes a lot of what are dubbed as pro-EU speeches. If you look at them closely, they're actually pro-single market speeches. They're not pro-EU. They very rarely make a speech in favour of Britain's membership of the EU relating to anything other than the single market. I'm not saying it's a good thing, it's a bad thing that Britain is in the single market. The present policy probably will be that EU sceptics may well offer Britain staying in the single market and distinguishing that from staying in the EU. So that's the first thing to put in the pond. Secondly is, somehow or other Britain, and I believe Hungary's in the same position, has got itself involved in guaranteeing 2 central banking systems. Not only its own central bank, but also as a shareholder in the European Central Bank. I believe, is Hungary a shareholder in the European Central Bank? I think it is, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I mean, what happens if the European Central Bank runs, well, it's obviously already insolvent. The question is, when is the insolvency going to be recognised? And who is going to make it solvent again, if it has to be made solvent? is there going to be call on the non-Eurozone shareholders? And why are they shareholders anyway, for goodness sake, in a central bank which is nothing to do with them particularly? In the case of the UK, it was all part of Britain getting involved in it when they were trying to become pro-EU back 20 years ago. But anyway, the bottom line is we've now got ourselves involved in guaranteeing, or partly guaranteeing, or possibly guaranteeing, or being looked for guaranteeing, two central bank systems. I mean, that's absolutely incredible. The next thing, and the last thing, I'll quickly say it, is that looking ahead to this campaign, the other thing is that we've focused on very much is that the status quo, in referendums, as you know, the electorate tends to favour the status quo. The status quo will not be on offer. We wouldn't be offering it, but the other side, which will be appealing to those who want to remain in the EU as it is, they can't offer it either, because, as, for example, John has just mentioned, Juncker's come out with all sorts of pro-integration proposals, and it would be quite impossible to say that things will stay as they were, bearing in mind particularly that following the last referendum in the UK in 1975, we've now had about, 5 further treaties have been pushed through on the basis of that referendum. So I think it will be much more difficult than people think for that. Now, I'm not going to say anything else not coherent. I just wanted to just throw a few ideas into the pool there. But I think that probably the most important thing is if the electorate in Britain ever get the idea that the single market and the EU are two different things, and you can stay in one and not the other, I'd say all bets are off in the referendum in that case, yeah?
If you read, well-informed people are people who read newspapers like the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and magazines like The Economist. And if the information provided there is not accurate, well, they tend to end up with inaccurate views themselves. And at the moment, the reporting, I think the analysis of the election over the weekend has not been as accurate as it should have been. But I think that will change. And when it does, I think that the reality of the depth of Eurosceptic feeling, considering that a large chunk of the Conservative vote is motivated by it, will be a factor. Now, what will be the result of that? Well, I think it will affect how Britain's European partners discuss points with them. They will want to make it easy for David Cameron to return to Britain and say to Parliament, we have secured major changes that reflect our interest. And I think they will go to some extent to make concessions to enable him to do this. And I think, secondly, there will be people around the table in Brussels and elsewhere who will want him to do well for their own purposes. My own feeling is, in this country, for example, Euroscepticism is a different animal to British Euroscepticism. There's no desire to leave the European Union, but there is a desire to have the European Union play less of a role in domestic politics. And that's not just true here, it's true in Portugal, it's true elsewhere. In all of the Mediterranean countries, there's obvious anxiety and disquiet about the fact that their economies have been very badly damaged by policies over which they have only very minimal control. And although they've been loyal, the Portuguese and the Irish and others have made extraordinary sacrifices to help the survival of the euro, nonetheless, it's a wake-up call for them to have the major political and economic developments in your country outside of your control. That makes people worried, and I think we're going to see more support for what I'd call kind of moderate, loyal Euroscepticism from peripheral countries, but not only from peripheral countries within the European Union. Now, if Britain were, and this is where I think British policy comes in, as long as Britain is a country which is maybe on the way out of Europe, it can't really become a leader of that kind of moderate Euroscepticism. If there were to be a decision to remain in, it would be open to the British to play that role. Until now, however, I have to say that other countries have not been, they've been, as I say, for a perfectly good reason, other countries, even when they've shared some of the British anxieties about the control of policy by France and Germany and the central bloc of countries, they have not been prepared to take many political risks. The present Prime Minister of Hungary is an exception here. But to mean, for example, or Klaus when he was president of the Czech Republic, although Klaus had relatively little control of foreign policy when he was president. So I think you might see, if Britain decided to remain in and try to gather a kind of coalition of countries who favoured less centralised control, a bigger role, a smaller role for the Commission, for example. I think they might have some answering. There might be some answering from the other countries, and then that you would have, in effect, a government in Europe and an opposition, the government wanting more centralisation, the opposition wanting less. And at the moment, that balance doesn't exist. So that's something could come out of that, and maybe it could develop into something of the lines that Anthony was just describing to us. But I mean, these are speculative arguments, and we don't know. But I do think that there is going to be a change, simply because, well, you will all have your own ideas, but I can't imagine that the current problems with the euro, the current policy of preserving a single European currency at all costs, whatever the damage it inflicts on particular countries like Greece, Spain, Italy, I can't believe that will continue unless... it's a kind of politics of the inevitable, which proves so damaging under the communists, and which has been revived in this kind of way. And one of the quotations from Keynes, which I like, is a remark he made, which is, he said, the unexpected always happens, the inevitable never. Yes, any more questions? Yes, Olivia.
I'm Petra Polaki, an intern of the Institute, and I would like to have a question regarding the Conservative Party's work. Although they have the majority within the parliament, the party discipline should be very strong to be actually able to carry out actions. And as you mentioned before, regarding the EU referendum, Cameron will have to decide whether he should let his colleagues campaign against the referendum or staying in or out. And how should Cameron treat this, or how can he treat this issue? And are there any further cleavages or issues which could divide the party?
Well, of course, there are a number of issues, but I would hazard this speculation, which is that if it weren't for the issue of Europe, then there would be continual rows in the Conservative Party over some of these issues, and there'd be threats not to... I mean, the last Parliament, there were a number of occasions when the backbenchers ignored what the government whips told them, and allowed and when the government had a large majority, of course, and allowed them and rebelled. Now, I won't rule that out happening here. But it seems to me that is less likely to happen on other issues as long as the European issue, the referendum issue, is still unsettled. And the reason I say that is this, that the rebels on Europe will not want to appear like the awkward squad, the people who object to everything, the people who are always in the opposition lobbies. And because of that, the narrow majority, plus that feeling on the rebellious right, will tend to maintain party discipline, exactly as you began by saying. Once the European issue is out of the way, if it ever is, then I think you might see more general rebelliousness. But they will want to keep their powder dry for the big issue. Now, Cameron will be aware of that, and he will tailor his policy accordingly. I can't predict what it would be, but remember Harold Wilson. I mean, Harold Wilson essentially thought, we're going to win this referendum. We've got the opposition on our side. We've got the BBC. We've got the newspapers. It'll be amazing if we lose it. So on that basis, he was able to be very liberal and say, well, my dear fellows, we all take different views around the cabinet table. Of course, you're free to campaign for those views. This is a major national issue. We should put country before party. We shouldn't impose discipline. So you can say what you want. And so Anthony Wedgwood, Benn and others, Tony Benn, they fought publicly in the No campaign. It didn't matter, because I don't say the result was foreordained, but it was pretty nearly foreordained, and therefore it was possible for the government to take a relaxed view of party discipline and to exempt people from the cabinet rule, as, by the way, sometimes happened with Liberal Democrats in the last government. But so I think that's probably the calculation Cameron would like to make. But if it looks difficult or dicey, I think he will try to condemn Eurosceptic ministers to a pledge of silence in the campaign, and that's probably as far as he can go. You can't force someone like Michael Gove, a very respected man whose views are serious and who is generally admired. You can't force him to stand on a platform and mouth platitudes and arguments that everyone knows he doesn't believe. It simply humiliates him and doesn't achieve anything except making you look like a tyrant. And so I don't think that will happen. But it could well be that, but I do think that in general, Europe will act until the European issue itself is for the vote, Europe will act as a kind of discipline on party rebelliousness on all other issues. Because most of the media, it's very clear that in the last year, the establishment has decided it doesn't want Britain to leave the European Union. It wants no doubt about the matter. And so, in a sense, the city establishment, the big business establishment is mobilizing, and the newspapers are coming on board. Although there are people like Nigel Lawson, the former Chancellor, like Roger Bootle, the distinguished city analyst, there are a number of professional economists who support the views that Anthony has expressed. The fact is that a great majority are now, so to speak, on board with the government's policy, and therefore there will be strong establishment pressure in the media and in other ways to go along with it. Generally, an American friend of mine, not talking about this issue or European politics, an American friend said to me once, "The establishment always wins in the end." Now, I don't think that's an absolutely iron rule, but it does bat 75 to 80%. And therefore, you have to assume that the referendum issue will be lost unless various things happen. Anthony mentioned one from his standpoint, and I think that's a very plausible argument. But in order for people to make a distinction between the EU and the single market, they have to hear a number of people articulate that distinction. It has to be seriously discussed. It can't be something that simply goes up and then is dismissed as wrong, irrelevant, off the point by the majority of commentators. So there has to be a genuine debate. If there isn't a genuine debate, and I think, as I say, the establishment would prefer not to have a sure thing, then I think we will remain in. But as I say, the Scots just voted 55%, less than only 6 months ago, 55 to 45% against having an independent Scotland. Well, you would never know it from reading the speeches in the election campaign or the commentary since the election. So politics never stops, and some issues are settled and go away. And those issues are where the public have made their opposition to something unmistakably clear. They'll never live with this. And unfortunately for the far left, most of their policies come into this category. Most of the time, a far left politician spends his time concealing what he intends to do. And it's only when he when he's forced to, in a sense, admit what his actual policies are, he loses support. In this case, I think that the policy which the administration and the establishment in general want will be hard to undermine, but not impossible. And after the election, it will be undermined by events after the referendum.
There are no more questions. Just remains for me to thank John. Thank you for coming. And and to say there are lunch refreshments. We hope you'll stay on for informal conversation.